We are so honored and excited to welcome our new guest on Hoops 360, Emmy Award-winning filmmaker and director of the upcoming series, The Dynasty, UConn Huskies, Matthew Hamachek. Matthew, thank you so much for your time and shedding a little bit of insight of your process of making this documentary. The docuseries chronicles Geno Auriemma's legendary and historic 40-year run of the UConn women's basketball program. It's a 3-part series that you can find on Apple TV that drops Friday, August 21st. And we were lucky enough to at least get a little early preview of the docuseries, and it was fantastic. Just to get this kicked off, your biggest takeaway from all of the research that you did, all of the film that you skimmed through, all of the interviews that you've done, putting it together, what was your biggest takeaway?
Well, first off, thanks for having me. It's interesting. When I started on the project with Erica Sashin, neither of us really knew all that much about the UConn women's basketball story to begin with. And I can understand, for your audience who's listening to that, thinking like, well, why should two people who really don't know anything about the team be the people who are chosen to go and make the documentary? But I actually think it was a huge asset because we didn't come in with any preconceived notion of what this story was about. I didn't know anything about Geno. I didn't know anything about any of the athletes. I mean, I'd heard of Diana Taurasi and Rebecca Lobo and Sue Bird and people like that, but I didn't know anything about the games or the makeup of the team or anything like that. So what that afforded us is the ability to really come in and listen to these people talk and to tell their stories and really focus on the elements of it that, while these people are going through extraordinary things, they're on the biggest stage imaginable with millions of people, in Paige Becker's case, watching her compete for a national championship, which has eluded her for a long time. But what Paige was going through in the 3rd episode, or what Rebecca was going through in the 1st episode, or what frankly Geno was really going through in the 2nd one, those are all things that I think we can relate to, whether we care deeply about basketball or women's basketball, or we don't care at all, because that fear of failure, that ego, the insecurities, the Paige talking about like the panic attacks that she'd have at night because she didn't know she'd ever be able to play the game that she loved again. Those are all things that I think we all go through when we're trying to sort of accomplish whatever it is we're trying to accomplish in life. And I think in the end, that's what the story is really about. It is about basketball. It is about UConn, and you get to know all of those things deeply, but it's really just this very human story about people who say, this is what I want to accomplish in life. And how do they overcome the obstacles to get there. So that's the thing that I loved about the story and being able to tell it.
As someone who, has covered this program pretty closely recently, I have so many interesting Geno and Paige questions for you that I can get into later. But can you just set the stage for us? Like, how did you get involved? When did you get involved? What did the access look like? Like, how did this come about?
Yeah, so Skydance Sports, John Weinbeck and Lauren Gaffney and all of those people over there had been talking to UConn for a while about making something. And then, they kind of got the initial conversations going. And then I was brought in and Erica was brought in during the 24-25 season, which is when they inevitably won the championship at the end. But I went up to Stores and basically went to a practice. And that was the first time that, and like I said, truly not knowing anything really about the program at all, went out to dinner with Geno afterwards. I didn't know anything about Paige and what she'd been through and the expectations that were on her. I didn't know anything about Azzi. And so it was this process of just sitting back and listening and listening to what they had to tell me, but then also talking to Geno and being like, hey, look, I want this to be great and you want this to be great, but here's what's going to be necessary in order to accomplish that. So what I said to him in that meeting, this is in January, I think. that season, maybe a little bit earlier. But I said, like, one, after the season's over, we're going to need to interview, and it's going to need to be about 15 hours worth of interviews scattered across many days. And that's a commitment for somebody like him, because he's always off on recruiting trips during the off season. He's always, there's tons of stuff that goes into what he does during the season and outside of the season. But then I said also, I'm going to need to put a microphone on you while you're coaching, and to hear everything that you're saying to the players. And we're going to need to be inside the coach's locker room at halftime during the national championship game, if you guys make it that far. And we're going to have to start this process sooner than later, so that when the national championship game comes around, you're not awkward about me being in there capturing what you're really like in those moments. And then it was just being there with them. And, everything from riding on the team bus to going out to Spokane with them for the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8 games, and being in the hotel with them, being at all their meals, all of their film sessions, flying on the NCAA chartered plane, which didn't have Wi-Fi or screens, and having to be really bored with all of the players across a 6-hour long flight from Spokane to Tampa, and just, I think, spending time with them. And by going through the process of just being there with them, a trust builds up. Right? Like, none of us slept after the national championship game. They had a much better reason not to sleep. But I was just so wired, because I was like, I cannot believe I just witnessed this thing happening. I was, I still have confetti in my office from the floor in Tampa, because it was such a special moment. And I had learned, as I was in the process of filming, that they had won 11 national championships in this very short period of time, and then all of a sudden went through 9 years of a drought. And Geno was questioning whether he should still be coaching. Paige was questioning whether or not she wanted to be with the program after the Tennessee game. And Coach, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but Coach really laid into her in front of the entire team. And you just start to realize, like, how special what happened in that season was, and how special the program is. And so I personally just felt lucky to be on that ride with them, and then the opportunity to sit back and say, okay, so we captured this. This was incredible. Now we're going to talk to 40 years of players and coaches and rivals and people who were intimate friends with, Pat Summitt, and really get into what that relationship was like with Geno and her, and all of this stuff. It just became endlessly fascinating to me, as somebody who came in with very little knowledge, but left with, I hope the audience feels this way too, a much better understanding of those 40 years.
It's fascinating. Yeah. And I had a million questions for you coming into this, and now I have a million more. But I will start with the interviews that you mentioned. There are so many great interviews throughout this entire docuseries, and you have the UConn greats represented here. Maya Moore, Sue Bird, Rebecca Lobo was a big highlight of the first episode. Jennifer Rosati, and of course, Paige Beckers as well. When you talk to these former Huskies, was there maybe one kind of common thread that you found that they all had in common? Maybe kind of this UConn DNA that they all oozed?
They all have this experience of coming to UConn, and it's this interesting thing. He does it very intentionally, but Geno takes these moments where he sits each of them down, and he says, so what do you want to accomplish while you're here? And this is regardless of if it was, Rosati or Lobo at the beginning, or if it's, Beckers or Sarah Strong now. And all the players inevitably say some version of the same thing. I want to be an All-American. I want to win a national championship, and I want to be on the Olympic team, or whatever it is. And I don't think he would call it this, but he kind of traps them once they've said that, because it's like, all right, great. Now here's what you're going to have to do to actually accomplish that. And that's when they get the full Geno experience, because he finds his superpower is not, and I think this sort of goes for all great coaches, and in a lot of ways, all of these great athletes, which is their superpower isn't what they're they're all great at shooting baskets. They're all great at drawing up plays for the coaches. But what makes Geno truly great is his ability to figure out what's this one thing that's holding this person back from accomplishing all of these goals, and how am I going to create this environment in which they have the ability to get over that hurdle, that stumbling block, whatever it is, and finally reach the and attain the thing that they've always wanted to. And for some people, like Stewie, it all happens over the course of 4 years. And then on the other side of things, there's Paige, who takes 5 years to get to that point. But the person that stood out the most, and I know this will be no shock to either of you or any of the people listening, is Diana Taurasi was a different human being that I've ever met my entire life. Like I have sat across from Tom Brady and people like that have accomplished things and are considered these warriors. And Diana Taurasi looks directly through you and is the most intimidating person I've ever encountered. And was just, I am in awe. She is my favorite athlete ever, and will be. And when Geno starts to talk about her as being an assassin, that was one of my favorite Geno lines in the entire series, because it was exactly what I felt sitting across from it. It felt like I was sitting across from a hitman who could just murder me in a moment's notice. So I loved it.
She could.
Yeah, I spot no lies there. Not at all.
Yeah.
All that checks out.
Everything you're talking about with Geno, I think, came across really strong in the third episode. Chronicling that season. I'm pretty sure a lot of that was not spoken about in the way that you were able to capture it.
Yeah.
I thought the interesting thing was you kind of opened the episode with Geno talking about recruiting her, and he says that it was different for him because he started to learn that these kids are influencers.
Yeah.
And they're starting to get this attitude of like, I'm the it girl. I have all these followers. And then you get to that point you mentioned earlier where, he does light into her and she doesn't have the leadership role. She's kind of too friendly with her teammates. She doesn't understand that being a leader and being a good friend and teammate is holding them accountable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, kind of just your thoughts on that through line, and if that was intentional, the influencer to that moment that season.
All of it was, because it's not just setting up who Paige is, but it's also setting up this idea of the world changing underneath Geno's feet, right? He's used to a certain way of doing things. Now, all of a sudden, and we don't go into NIL all that much, but it's a different world than what he's used to. And stores is this like wonderful, sleepy place where not a lot's going on. But the problem is now the world comes to on your phone for all of these people, and like capturing what Paige had to deal with in terms of the expectations that were always on her to be the person who like returned UConn to greatness, but she kept falling short because of injury, and then eventually because of these leadership things. But yeah, it's what Paige is going through. It's Geno trying to talk to her about like the expectations and the outside noise and all of those things. And it's also inevitably what he's going through, which is, as the drought continues, he talks in the series about how he really questioned whether or not he should still be coaching anymore, because he says you keep coming up short, so of course you question it. And all of that stuff was endlessly fascinating. But you're right, like the thing that we got everybody to talk about, which was really tricky, and stuff that I know Geno really felt uncomfortable talking about it, was that film session after the Tennessee game, where he calls her out for being a bad teammate and not caring about her teammates because of her leadership style in front of all of them. And you see Sarah Strong and KK and Jana talking about like how awkward it was to be in that room and to witness that. But the interesting thing for me was, as an outsider, that whole season, I was like, what happened that turned this team around? That the team that couldn't beat Notre Dame, couldn't beat USC, and then went to Tennessee. And, Tennessee's always going to be Tennessee. But at that time, they weren't a powerhouse in the same way that they were when Pat was there, right? So it's like they should have won that game, right? And they didn't. So that was like the low point of low points, because I think the other thing that was going on there that they talked about in the interview, but we didn't include, was that game was supposed to be this moment for Paige to be able to go down to Tennessee and experience what it's like to play there with that crowd and that arena, and to have that moment in her final year. And it's like, there's not much time left now. There's 3 or 4 weeks until the tournament starts. And this is it. And I think Geno, as I think you probably could tell when you were watching it, what your audience will be able to tell when they watch it, he cares deeply about these players, right? Yeah. Even when he's doing these things to Paige, or even when his Paige says, like, they're not talking to each other anymore, right? There is that period where they weren't talking to each other.
That was shocking.
And this is like right before the tournament starts. And Paige talks about how she thinks she's going to quit, but she takes the step back and realizes that he's asking something of her. And so one of the really interesting things is, okay, so what happened next? And I remember Jana was sitting there, and Jana says to us, so Paige calls a players only meeting. And when Jana said that in the interview chair, I had no idea that had happened, because nobody had talked about it before. And so I said, okay, talk about that. And then Azzi was right after Jana that day. And then Sarah was right after Azzi. And so we got each of them to talk about not only the film session after Tennessee, but then the players only meeting. And you start to put these pieces together and you're like, oh, this is why this thing turned around the way that it did, because Geno cared so much about Paige that he was willing to really push her to the brink of quitting, because he knew that if she didn't, the same thing that had happened in years past, whether it was with Caitlin Clark or whoever else they came across, South Carolina, was going to happen again. And it was just an incredible thing to sort of witness, and to sort of not investigate, but you know what I mean? Like to figure out, like, why did this team turn around? Because it didn't really make sense.
As part of that sequence, I believe, is when Azzi and Paige come out and say that they're in a relationship.
Yeah.
And it is relevant to the basketball, because you talk about it in that leadership sense. We get a sense from someone very close to her about what it is. And Azzi does say, it wasn't secret, it's private. We want to be respectful of that. But also it being in the show, like, how did you go about deciding that was going to be part of it, especially if you kind of know what's happened since?
For me, it was only relevant because it was part of the larger story. So, neither of them really spoke to this part of it directly, but I thought it was interesting that a person who cares and loves her teammates so much, and that's the leadership issue that she's facing, is also, they both talk about they were in a relationship. That's an interesting thing to understand while both of those two things are happening at the same time. So to me, that's why it was relevant. Obviously, I don't know this for sure, but I doubt very much this is the first time that two players have been dating at UConn in the history of the program, right? This is nothing new, whether it's at this level or the WNBA. So beyond that, it's not necessarily interesting on its own. It's more interesting for the broader context of, like, everything that's going on that season. So that's why it was really fascinating to me. And I thought it was worth including, again, not for this sort of the tabloidy nature of it, but just for this sort of deeper, more important sort of human element of the storytelling.
Yeah, it came across.
Yeah, absolutely it did. And there is, speaking of a human element of things, kind of a fascinating juxtaposition of the two different Genos that we get. Episode 1 opens up and he's saying, "It's not my effing shoes that are squeaking," yelling at the person. Was that you that he was yelling to behind
He's
camera?
Yelling at me. Yeah, that was every interview.
I was like, oh, this poor guy's just trying to make the sound right, get away with the
Geno
squeaking, he's getting
experience.
yelled at. Exactly. And we see the full Geno experience. Him getting on Rebecca Lobo, him getting on Paige Beckers, and how there was, he hasn't really changed his coaching style and didn't really need to over the span of 40 years. We see this tough, rough, competitive side of Geno. And then we see sides of it where we see a little bit more vulnerability and a little bit more insecurity. We're seeing this softer side of Geno. I'm curious, was there a specific moment when you felt like your relationship with him or his comfort with you really started to shift, where he went from being that hard-nosed coach, that Geno that we know from the sidelines, to maybe more Geno Auriemma, the human being?
I think that Geno, like everybody, all of us talking here, are more complicated than sort of what you probably get from an initial encounter with him, right? He comes across as this guy with an outside sort of swagger, confidence, and bravado, and all of that stuff. I think he's always both versions of this, right? Like, you have the guy who had a very complicated relationship with Pat Summitt, and we go into great depth about how she felt about that relationship, why the series ended, which was really interesting to me personally, because I think that, there was this assumption that all of it was because of the Maya Moore recruitment stuff and blah, 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 because that was kind of the answer that was given. But then when we talk to these people who, were, great friends with Pat, what they said is, yeah, that was sort of what the public assumed, but it was really about like how much that relationship between the two of them had gotten to a place where Pat just didn't want to be a part of it anymore. And like, things like that weren't part of the public narrative, but that these people who were there and really understood it could speak to. So that was fascinating. But then, after we've gotten all of the sort of the edgier sides of Geno and that relationship with Pat, you start to realize the story of this kid who came from Italy when he was really young, didn't know how to speak the language, and is on this playground where he feels like this complete outsider. All the other kids have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and he has sausage and peppers. He can't speak to anybody. And he realizes, in his mind at least, that the way to feel like he belonged was to beat people at something, to be better than them. And he says it's this sort of childish concept, but something that has kept him going through 40 years of coaching. And so, people talk about how he actually has imposter syndrome, and he always thinks that everybody's going to figure out the next day that he has no idea what he's doing. And so that's the kind of character that if you were writing a fiction screenplay that you want to create, but probably seems too unrealistic if you were scripting it. But in reality, that's who this guy is. And that's what makes him endlessly fascinating, is he is always trying to like figure out what those things are for everybody else and sort of, get it out of their way so they can accomplish their goals. But he's going through it himself. And I think that's what makes him probably so good at it, right? If he really just was this confident guy who comes across the way he does in most of his interviews, I just don't think that he would be great at his job.
There are a few, like the Pat Geno of it is really interesting. Yeah. And he makes this comment, I think, during that section to you, where he says, I'm not exactly the face you want to put on women's basketball.
Right.
I mean, I guess I'll just ask you that then. Like, what did you take away from that? Because later in the series, you also kind of very briefly show the Dawn Geno interaction before that championship game. And of course, this most recent year, they have a much more public, maybe antagonistic reaction.
Yeah. It's interesting. I have, been able to look at just hours and hours and hours of footage of Geno throughout the years. And what I noticed was a guy who, as I can't remember the exact words that he used, but the interaction that he had with Dawn, obviously he regrets it. There were people who were trying to say, oh, this is who Geno is and all this stuff. And, we're tough on Geno in the series. And I think we really point out we're very fair, but we're tough. And I think we show who he is in both great ways and not so great ways and everything in between. That being said, you know, that incident with Dawn in the last tournament to me was an anomaly, where you have a guy who obviously reacted in a way that he regrets and has talked about, and it was incredibly unfortunate. But then when you look back and you look at the way he reacted after Mississippi State ended the 111 game winning streak, he's smiling and is gracious. And yeah, he's an edgy guy and has these moments, but that was the first time that I'd ever seen anything like that. So I kind of think of that as this one-off event and not part of who he is as a person. Because to me, he is a very relatable person who, as we talked about, this guy who, what I find fascinating about Geno is the guy who, at the beginning of episode 2, he starts off by talking about winning that first national championship as, he's on this high like he's never been before. And then by the end of the episode, when he's won 11, he says, I was numb. It didn't mean anything to me anymore. And that's like who Geno is. He's incredibly complicated, and he's, the little kid on the playground who doesn't speak English and feels like an outsider. And he's this titan, who's one of the greatest coaches of any sport at any time.
Yeah, it was fascinating to kind of see all of those layers of someone who is a very complicated human being peeled back slowly but surely. I'm just curious because especially in the first episode, getting footage in today's day and age when everybody has a camera and everything's on social media and it's easy to find games, that's one thing. I say easy, understanding how difficult that probably was to gather even in the digital age. But in the first episode specifically, when there's videos of, Rebecca Lobo and Jennifer Rosati drinking beers in their dorm rooms and practice footage. I loved it because I thought, I look at Rebecca Lobo, she's this titan of the game, and here she is just sitting in her dorm room with her friends drinking beer like we all did once upon a time. Where did you find all of that footage, and how in the world is it all so high quality?
So it's I hope I'm not going to get in trouble with her for saying this, but it's Rebecca's home video footage, and it's been sitting above her washing machine and dryer in her home, and she had never looked at it once the entire time. And we asked all the players for footage. Like, we have photos from Diana that of her and her parents, and we have snapshots from everybody who gave us personal archive. But that, first off, that footage is incredible, and
awesome.
And I think it reminds you when you're watching it of the thing that we were always trying to do while we were making this, which is to remind people that, yes, they are superstar athletes and they are doing things on a national stage that most of us could never compare or relate to in our lives, but that they're just humans and they're just kids. And there was this constant reminder of that for me, like, you look at Paige when there's footage of her flying around for these games, and she's got this like neck pillow that and it's got all these like, I don't know, I still remember this, like it has all these colors, and you're just reminded like this is a person who is under the brightest lights and the most pressure, but she's just a couple years removed from being a child. You know what I mean? And it's like to imagine what it's like to be going through that, and to remind the audience in episode 1 that these are just kids in college and they're still going through all these things. I just thought that was an important thing to keep hitting over and over again throughout the series, because sometimes we lose sight of, who we're watching on TV. So that was important for me.
As Diana will tell you, and Sue Bird, I mean, they did a lot of drinking in stores.
That does seem to be a very common thread throughout all of the years in stores. There's not a lot to do over there.
No.
That's all you can do. Yeah.
As we kind of close here, kind of a tandem question, I think the interesting thing about one of the many, clearly, about doing the UConn story now is they still have Sarah Strong. They're still very much like regular Final Four contenders. Like this dynasty is not over. A, do you see yourself possibly tapping back into them at some point? But also B, what's next for what seems like potentially a longstanding dynasty series here?
I mean, look, I'm no basketball expert, and I shouldn't pretend to be one. I learned what a backdoor layup was while making this thing. So for me to predict what's going to happen to the dynasty after this, going forward would be silly. But I think it would be equally silly for anybody to pretend that UConn doesn't have just as much of a chance as anybody else of winning the national championship every single year. And yeah, Sarah is incredible to watch and incredible to talk to, right? There's just this calm confidence with her where you're just like, yeah, this is what these people are like. I would get frazzled in a practice with Geno, just the way he talks to people, but you can tell that she can handle it, and her basketball IQ is through the roof. And I think, every year, it's like I follow the team on Instagram now, and every time I open my phone, they've recruited the next great player, and you're just like, yeah, of course they did. And of course, Geno's going to figure out the one thing that this incredible All-American player who has more raw natural talent than anybody else in the country, he's going to figure out the one thing that they don't have yet and get them to break through that. And I would be shocked if Sarah Strong graduates and doesn't have at least one more national championship. But look, as a person who started this thing, probably never having watched a complete women's basketball game to now, like where I will turn it on, whether it's the Dallas Wings games or going to UConn games in person or watching them now. I'm obsessed with the sport. I feel like it reminds me of the basketball that I fell in love with when in the 90s, and just like the physicality of it and everything I love watching now, and I will be a lifelong fan of UConn and the sport in general.
It's intoxicating, isn't it?
It really is.
It's fun. It feels like it is basketball in its purest form. And you and your entire team have done such a beautiful job of portraying that in this docuseries. Again, you can find it on Apple TV. It drops on Friday, August 21st. That is the Dynasty UConn Huskies. Matthew Hamachek, the director and producer of this docuseries. Matthew, thank you so much for all of your time, all of your insight, and all of your hard work in making this come to life. We appreciate you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for having me and talking about the series. I'm glad you guys liked it.